the upcoming exhibitions as part of this project, which I've just mentioned this year. You also have a project opening very soon at the Walker Arts Centre in Minneapolis. So, without further ado, I thought we could maybe begin by looking at a work which was actually one of the first works that I saw of James's. And it's a work called Rosebud. It was the work that I saw at the Venice Biennale in 2014. And one of the interesting things that I hope we can explore a little bit in the talk today is the relationship between, I think, video and sound in your work. And certainly in Rosebud, when I first saw that piece, there was an extraordinary, visually it's an incredibly rich, kind of complex piece in many ways. But it felt like at least 50% of that work was the soundtrack and the way that you were using sound. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that in terms of, whether the video comes first or the sound comes first and how that operates. But maybe we should just start by screening that work. I think it's about 12 minutes long, is that right?
Yep.
And actually, for once, I'm delighted it's slightly grey and murky in Bergen because it means the light in this quite bright room is down a bit. But could we start with that?
Yep.
Are you going to... Okay. It's really interesting seeing that again after having the work downstairs for a few weeks. There's a lot of things that I'd like to talk through with you, but maybe you could start, James, by just talking a little bit about that work.
Sure,
and how that came about.
Yep. I mean, it's both, I guess it's worth speaking a bit about the context of the piece, which quite rarely, I guess, for my work, it's one which kind of relies on a certain amount of anecdote or knowledge. The main kind of body of images, or one of the strands of imagery in the video, are these kind of very still, static shots of open books on a desk. And these have been kind of where the genitals of these kind of erotic or erotically charged, potentially, images have been sandpapered away. I was on a residency in Japan, and while visiting a library in Tokyo, came across in the arts section, while just flicking through this book on Mapplethorpe, realizing that someone had sort of sat and somehow removed, and I could see these kind of scraped marks, and when I asked the librarian about it, they kind of informed me that basically when these books were being imported from Europe in the mid-90s, a law which still stands now around kind of the allowance of an image that can incite arousal in a viewer, being not possible to be held and distributed in a public space. So, literally, it wasn't the librarians that had to do it, but literally someone in a kind of customs office, somewhere on a kind of customs border. I would have to sit, and this was an institution that was built in the mid-90s and would have had hundreds of catalogues being sent over from Europe and North America, and someone had to kind of sit through and really kind of judge on a very subjective basis what would constitute around, because it wasn't really about like the depiction of a genital or a sexual act. It was because that could occur in a kind of medical context that would be acceptable to show, or it was really about the capacity of the image to arouse, and so then this person, a customs official, or a customs, probably not even official, if you like, was tasked with this job of kind of sitting and flicking through the books and then kind of lovingly caressing away the arousing content or the arousing source. Yeah. And this sort of anecdote and this idea of this individual and this viewer or something moving through these books really excited me. And then the images themselves, I mean, they're very strong. They're great works by great photographers, but they're also the kind of violence and this kind of sensuality that's kind of pressed upon them produces this kind of new image, which I found extremely compelling. So I spent a lot of time filming these. I don't quite know why I filmed them rather than photographing them. I had no real plan as to what I would do with them, but somehow felt compelled to film them, and then really sat on that material for about 6 or 8 months, kind of returning to it, like could see it had a strength to it, but not really knowing what I quite wanted to do with it. Which for me is quite a common way of processing a lot of material. Things tend to sort of be gathered and then semi-worked with, or at least edited and put into some kind of folder, and then there's a kind of waiting and a sitting and just returning to, while working on other things always, but kind of their actual place kind of comes up later, in the practice, if you like. And so it was about 6 or 8 months later, having then gone on a very parallel set of research, working a lot with this little kind of cheap underwater kind of GoPro style camera, and really just experimenting with trying to use a camera in the most sort of physical and material way of just like not even looking through a viewfinder and just playing with it, kind of being semi-submerged in a pool or subjected to some kind of extreme weather, or just kind of using this thing like an extension of my hand or something, and just gathering data on it. So I'd been kind of fiddling with this very material way with a camera. And then it was much later on the invitation to make a piece for an exhibition. I really started to realize that there was actually this kind of quite absolutely contrasting but strangely beautifully kind of joining kind of tendencies in these two kind of bodies of footage which I generated around like the kind of trembling and sort of tense sort of surface of something, So whether it's liquid kind of literally being visibly rippling, and seeing that kind of meniscus of a pool as the wind blows on it or something, or literally this kind of this sort of charged layer of printer ink in a book, and there was just something about kind of focus on this kind of minuscule layer, which seemed to emerge. And I really set it about trying to make a piece that would just sandwich the two together in a way. I mean, it's not really logical, but it's just about trying to use a piece to kind of hold together two kind of discrete ideas and sort of make them make sense or something. And I think that's what how the piece evolved.
I mean, I think it's interesting the way that you talk about these kind of surfaces, whether it's the surface of the printed image, which is kind of scraped back and scraped away, or whether it's these kind of membranes, as you were talking about, that you kind of penetrate with the camera. And I think it's interesting that you've talked about trying to kind of enter the image somehow, or using a camera to try and almost forensically kind of approach and get underneath an image, or sort of involve yourself. And one of the things that I've always thought about video, and I think it comes through in your sound as well, which has a similar kind of proximity or something. It often sounds like the sound of scraping or something, very much between a kind of inside and an outside. I think it's really interesting, that idea that you're trying to get underneath the surface of something, and somehow, kind of play with that very that kind of threshold, I guess. And
because it's precisely. I think it's very much like about a threshold of between a kind of reading and a kind of feeling or something, which is a sort of on other registers is going on, I think, in the work. But that particularly it's illustrated very literally, say, in this piece where you have a camera at one point doing a tracking shot across a $50 bill, which has this eye, but it's the camera's getting so close, you start really looking at just like the hairs and the kind of grains in the printer ink, and you see. So it's this thing of when you start reading an image as an eye, or as an image of an eye, and you really start just entering it in as a pattern of texture and a pattern of the distribution of ink on a surface or something. And so there's this kind of movement between something being like a sign or something to be kind of read, and something just to be kind of just gorged on, as a kind of surface that has this kind of sensuality.
And that's what I was going to say. There's a kind of intimacy to it, and a kind of sensuality, and the images obviously have this kind of erotic charge, and that's why they've been kind of sanded back. But is that something that you're kind of constantly returning to in the work? This kind of these moments of charge, if you like, or intimacy, or
I guess that piece is unusual in that it had a quite clear quite sort of political, if you like, starting point. But I mean, often for me, it's really the starting point is really essential when it's really about kind of sifting and gathering and going through material and really just finding these things which just sort of which kind of resonate, in a way that I really can't necessarily sort of speak of or decide or look for. It's often find myself going back to certain kind of ideas of not necessarily in the work, but certainly in the way he spoke about it, that Stan Brakhage would speak, the American sort of structuralist filmmaker would speak of wanting to make films that really like looked at the world in a way that was more sort of akin to how a baby sees the world prior to its kind of starting to learn to differentiate, the suspended lampshade from the pattern on the ceiling from someone's hand coming into view in the pram, and there's some point where one starts kind of separating those things and start understanding hand as different from lampshade, as different from ceiling, but there's a kind of precognitive looking, of course, a kind of looking which hasn't understanding and reading hasn't yet quite entered it, and of course I by no means do that fully in the work. I mean, there's full of very specific kind of clues and things left in that are very much producing associations, and I play a lot with that. But one of the sort of approaches, I suppose, in the work or tendencies is to sort of try and sort of almost like look at something in a way that kind of blanks out information, so you really kind of really just approach it like without reading or without knowledge or.
I think video is very interesting in those terms, and it's something that I've thought about a lot, actually. This idea that the video almost becomes a kind of surrogate looking. There's a kind of passivity and a kind of automatic way in which it records information. And I think there's something kind of uncanny about that in video, in the way that it sort of mirrors the way that we sort of internalize and make images of the external world. And if you can see the camcorder, if you like, as a kind of strange surrogate for our looking or our consciousness. And it's why, again, I think that, some of that sound, which I don't know exactly how you made it, but when it feels like it's this kind of scraping, it's almost like the sound when you make a home movie and it kind of rubs against your face or the microphone kind of touches something. And it's something external, but it becomes internalized into the machine. And I've always felt that that's a very powerful and quite unsettling, uncanny aspect of video, that the sound, even more than the images, somehow reinforce this kind of body of this thing, and this again, this kind of threshold between the outside and the inside.
I mean, I think it's something, these are kind of moments of sort of reminding you that it's just, I guess on its simplest level, it's this kind of reminding you that it's just a thing being recorded or something, but then it's, I guess, one element of that that's quite, particularly I think in this piece is that I guess I first got into that particularly because I remember filming in the library and the windows were open, you could hear the crows crowing outside, and so it was that sense of this image which was about this kind of intense focus, it's an intense focus of a camera on an image that had been subjected already to this attention, this kind of rubbing and this cultural attention or something, but then simultaneously there's just the sound of an afternoon outside or something, this kind of like, so this kind of simultaneity element that's produced, I guess, by that, and that's something also, this kind of leaking in, this sense of like things, the world or life leaking in to the image, and going on despite the image or something. But it's also, I guess, often in the videos I play with that and produce a lot of that stuff artificially, so you can kind of it's also very manipulative. You can kind of really kind of create. You can make something sound like it was being filmed at a time that was tenser than it really was, or you can kind of make produce the sound of concentration or something, or not. Or other times just totally overlay absolutely like lush music, So you kind of it's a kind of framing you're doing or something with sound.
Again, it was really interesting seeing that film now after, as I say, you having produced the work downstairs, because suddenly the soundtrack, which, as I said in the introduction, always felt like it was at least 50% of the work in a way. I felt like I had this very different sort of relation to it, now seeing where you've gone in terms of beginning to separate the video and the syncing of the video directly from the soundtrack. But maybe before we get ahead of ourselves and explore that, how, in terms of when you're making a video like that, and certainly The work at the Chisenhale, not blacking out, just turning off the lights, this work, Raking Light, these works that were produced around that time, they still very much were kind of single or double channel video works.
Yep.
And they had this incredibly sort of evocative soundtrack, but the soundtrack was always kind of synced in and it was edited in.
Yep.
Where were you, but in terms of your working process, was it that you were working with the video imagery first and then you were kind of trying to bring in some of that sound in the way that you've just described, think about how you could manipulate and create mood, or could it sometimes be the other way around? Were you sometimes working with the sound first and bringing...
It's really totally totally equal or totally changing. It's something where I'll have, spend some... I'll spend some periods working purely with a particular... making particular recordings and playing with those and just sort of finding out what I can and getting what I can from those, and then other times working just with images that have no sounds. And there's quite kind of phases of separate experimentation with these different kind of mediums, and then all that stuff gets sort of filed, and when I more earnestly sort of start a piece, then it's kind of really about drawing on these quite separate sort of strands of fiddling and research and kind of generating, which could be visual and could be sonic, So there's a lot of kind of pre-made or pre-cooked things which I have, and also bits of older things which perhaps didn't end up in the final cut of an older piece then suddenly make sense. So I draw on that, and that again, that can be a sonic or it could be visual. So the two really are totally interlinked, and for me it's very important that they, right from the beginning, I'm kind of working with them together, because I think that kind of it's that intermeshness which is where I can produce a kind of intensity, I think, and it's, for me, it's where a lot of the authorship is. I think if anything, very often the images are fairly blank in the work. Perhaps this isn't a great example because they're so absolutely sort of figurative and absolutely like of something, but often there's a kind of neutrality in a way to the images, and then the music or the sound is where I'm perhaps a lot more adept in terms of a kind of like genuine authorship rather than just simply an appropriation, at really sort of composing a very nuanced kind of environment to read that thing, or to project into that thing. So it's, for me, it's the way the two affect one another. The sonic affects the visual, and the visual affects the sonic. That and the kind of misreadings and the kind of inferences that you can make. That I guess, where a lot of the work is. So the two are pretty simultaneous and overlapping.
And in terms of the imagery, which you've explained in terms of Rosebud, that there were these kind of two predominant bodies: the books that you came across, which you videoed, and then this work that you were making with this kind of little mobile GoPro underwater. But I know that as important as that kind of footage that you produce yourself is, and I know that you produce a lot of that footage in quite a diaristic way, maybe not even knowing why you're doing it, but just kind of gathering and collecting. You also work with a lot of found footage as well.
Yep.
And I don't know, what's the relationship between those two things and how you...
I guess I've come to film, not actually so much in the exhibition here, but the last few sort of video pieces have been a lot more of my own footage, but I certainly come to it through, and this piece is sort of probably 70%, if one could guess, of my own stuff, and then a smaller amount of appropriated material. But I really approach what I film myself very much as if I was sampling it, you could say. So for and certainly the starting point for me in working with video was I began by kind of doing this kind of music and sort of sound stuff as a teenager, and then in art school, I guess, started experimenting with video, and the first sort of port of call was to sort of take footage and soundtrack it, and the pleasure of kind of creating a new soundtrack for an existing film, was how things sort of began and how I got into working with video. And for me, it's always been very natural to kind of collage and to work with existing things that I was saving. And it was kind of, at a certain point, wanting to sort of try and find ways of making the work more direct in some way. I don't quite know what that directness is, but trying to sort of bring more of my life in it, or more of my sort of a point of view that was more my own into it, rather than this thing of hijacking existing points of view, I guess, which I see as a kind of, the kind of collaging of and disrupting points of view from other sources. But I never really had any ideas for like a film shoot or anything I wanted to do with like people or a camera crew or anything like that. So so really the thinking felt the most natural, I guess, point, and the simplest point really was just to get a camera, and which I hadn't had a camera, for years, even though I'd been making videos for years, but was to buy one and just start sort of trying to film every day, and just making this thing of record something every day and see what it is, and then just keep, filing that and building up into a basically I had a hard disk then full of things, and
found footage that you produced yourself.
Treat as archive, if you like, or treat in the way you treat any source material, So it's always been that way around, I guess, that I've worked.
And is that similar with the sound as well? Is there a lot of found sound in terms of samples? But some, and we'll talk about the new work a little bit later on, but I know that some of that was produced very specifically, but is it a similar kind of balance?
Yeah, certainly. I would say in the piece we just watched, that's there's a lot of found sound and a lot of field recordings and or things, the sound taken off some camcorder material but used elsewhere, or so it's sort of it's similar. It's I mean, it's really in the editing, and I guess when the work's so in the editing, it's kind of the actual provenance of the source, or whether I sort of instigate it or not, kind of disappears because it becomes about that. Those decisions. That's where the writing happens, I guess.
Maybe we should look at another work, Raking Light. Do you want to say something to introduce that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess this is a piece coming. I mean, there's quite a lot of overlaps, but it's coming from quite a different sort of time. I guess I really wanted to make something. I guess I'd been working a lot more with sort of natural imagery, and really wanted to kind of make something that was totally unabashedly kind of in the landscape and of the landscape. But actually, in the end, it ended up becoming this thing much more about I think photography and some kind of idea of sort of forensic photographic kind of vision or something. So it's I tried to make something quite landscapey, but in the end it ended up quite sci-fi.
Should we have a look at it?
And it's I guess it's the first piece where I was trying to work a lot more musically and trying to work a lot more musical material, and rather than kind of concrete or kind of textural sound material, but work a lot more with things like harmony and melody and tone and stuff. So
this was shown at Cabinet Gallery.
Yep.
And then was part of the exhibition last year at Kunstfrei München in Munich.
Yep.
And then is now currently in Edinburgh, I think, with the British Art Show, right?
That's right.
So as you say, you were beginning to think much more kind of musically in terms of some of the way that you were thinking about the soundtrack in that film. But I think for people who've seen the work downstairs, there might be some of that imagery and certainly the palette and some of the kind of texture of that work that feels like it's kind of come into the new work downstairs, Crumb Mahogany. But immediately after that piece, you made a work for the Whitechapel, which in a way felt like it was really the beginning of some of the thinking around this new work downstairs, but also just in terms of the materiality and the kind of software that you're using and the tools that you were using. Do you have an image of the show?
I don't
you
think
don't.
I do on this computer.
But it was the first time, maybe I can describe it and you can say something about it, but it was for a kind of strand of program that the Whitechapel Gallery in London introduced a couple of years ago, where they invited artists to work with a collection and to kind of find a way of showing or reframing or staging aspects of this collection within one of their gallery spaces. And you chose to select one Francis Bacon painting and to show it in the room, which was curtained. So it was the first time you'd used these curtains, I guess, in the work. And then to have the Francis Bacon painting hung against the curtain, and then with a soundtrack playing into that space which you'd composed specifically for that experience, I guess. And you used one of these racks that we have downstairs, right, and the speakers for the first time.
So I mean, I'm working quite a lot in a sort of organising group shows in various ways and screenings and kind of increasingly kind of curating group shows, different spaces, and it's something I very much enjoy in terms of, I guess, another way of thinking about collage, another way of thinking about what it means to bring these kind of separate things together and to let things rub off on each other and make up a new whole from quite discrete parts. And so it was I was very excited when they invited me to kind of curate this show, but it was kind of an interesting process where, in a way, in kind of reverse of the usual process, here, like, all the works were given. I mean, you were sent a PDF with every work that was in this collection, and you could show whatever you wanted, whereas, of course, normally the logistics is about finding things and meeting people and discovering work, and it's about threads that lead you to different pieces, whereas it was all a given. You could have anything you wanted for the exhibition, because that was the kind of deal of the exhibition. So I kind of felt like it'd be nice to sort of reverse that process and show a single painting and just really work with kind of what it is to stage something and orchestrate something. And I've been thinking and working, a lot more, if you like, musically and wanting to sort of find a way of sort of pushing the sort of sonic kind of aspect, I suppose, in what I do in perhaps a new direction and see what could happen. And so it felt like a really good time and opportunity to sort of try working purely with making the soundtrack, but for the image or around the image, or and the piece that I made end up doing, in a way, just as I was saying earlier, with this idea of the kind of manipulative audio effects. It's sort of at times I would make things that would perhaps make one think of Francis Bacon, or would sort of sound like, would bring one, very kind of close up, the kind of textural things that were similar in atmosphere to the figure in the painting. And other times there'd be things that would more kind of speak to the kind of time in which the painting was made. And basically you could use sound to kind of oscillate on various registers around kind of what like how one might read the image, or why it's there, or where it came from, and it was very much, I guess I found as doing it, I realized that kind of actually working in this kind of multi-channel way of kind of being able to kind of, by placing seats and then circling people in that show, it was 5 because by circling them around people, and I would work on the piece that way. So I'd build one of these setups in the studio, and then I could sort of compose the piece by kind of outputting different sort of samples to different speakers. You could really create this very kind of physical, very quite sort of sculptural experience of sounds. You could really immerse someone in something, in an atmosphere or a tone or a mood, and then kind of shatter it and put something very, very kind of contrasting, if you like, in. Or similarly, you could have things that are very kind of musical and rich, or other things that are very much kind of like close-up kind of scratches or textures. And I realized I could just do a lot of this stuff in this very kind of physical, very kind of engulfing kind of way with these kind of clusters of speakers. So it was a kind of, I guess, a first experiment with that and a finding out of what
how long was that soundtrack?
It was about sort of 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Yeah.
And you were beginning to record specific, because you were working with a choir in London, or some singers at that point as well, right?
So I guess in somewhat in a kind of interest in trying to work a bit more musically, I was starting to do this thing of perhaps if I was already working with certain samples in a piece, then taking those samples, which might have just come from songs or records, I'd take those to musicians who I would then spend a day recording with them, improvising in response to them. So I worked with a group of singers called Vocal Juice, who are a kind of harmony trio, but they've been working together for 15 years. They're very in tune with one another, and they're both kind of jazz trained and also early music trained. So they're really very diverse in what they can do. And we literally just spent the day with kind of headphones in, playing kind of samples, and they would all kind of improvise and sing and kind of make new melodies in response. And I did the same thing with a a sort of composer, singer-songwriter called Verity Sussman, just making some organ and piano parts. And this, I guess I found it, I was at a point where I was working a lot with collage and with the idea of the cut-up sonically, which is, I guess, how one comes to sound through art school and things, is always through Dada and Burroughs and thinking about things in terms of rupture or something, or rupture of the existing, or breaking through. And I guess I was kind of the thing which I couldn't do as someone who's not musically trained and doesn't really have that background, was begin a work or begin a body of material that I could work with, much more in terms of ideas of harmony and melody and cohesiveness and kind of the intermeshed musically, So I found this way of working seemed to offer a chance to kind of really build up a stock of things which I knew would harmonically and musically and melodically really kind of resonate together and work, But so I could still compose in the same way, but always with this kind of starting point of musical kind of togetherness.
And even in Raking Light, which we just watched, there's this kind of, the voice is much more present in a lot of the sound.
Yep.
And again, the voice is somehow this kind of resonant, or the voice in its relation to the body, because even though you're talking, I remember when you were talking to me about recording some of these things, I was wondering whether suddenly we would get these kind of long melodic vocal passages. But actually they're still quite restrained, or they've kind of brought back to this idea of a kind of stuttering proximity, or as much as it's the voice harmonizing, it's like this sense of breathing or something.
Yeah. No, it's very often. I mean, perhaps the next piece we'll watch has some very clearly sort of sung musical lines, but there is very little of that. In the end, I think these sessions would produce a lot of course, hours of stuff. But the things I'm often drawn to are these things where someone's more like when someone's murmuring or singing to themselves, or it's not necessarily like for public address. You know, it's a more private relationship to singing or something, or more internalized kind of singing or something, you know, more the kind of thing you mumble while doing the dishes or something than when you're being asked to sing. So I've often found myself drawn to those kind of moments. And
also, I mean, you've talked to me as well about the software that you use to compose these. And again, I think I was talking to somebody else about this in a very different context, in the context of the kind of histories of dance music and how they've been affected by the kind of the sort of limitations, but also the structural forms that are built into a program like Cubase or Ableton, which you use. And again, it becomes like a kind of collaging thing. You know, you're basically dragging samples around and collaging them physically on a screen and then allowing them to play.
Yep. I mean, it's I guess, I mean, making the work is very much like a kind of songwriting or something. It's about, you know, trying out groups of things and seeing what it does to you, and you know, finding those kind of sweet, kind of effective moments or strong moments, and then working more into those and getting rid of the rest. And you're sort of following this thing until a piece kind of comes together. But of course, the tools very much affect that kind of those wanderings, you know. So the way you interact with the samples and the way you interact with the material has a big impact on the kind of composition.
I think we should talk about the new work. So what you've done downstairs is, when we began talking about the new commission, you were very clear that you wanted to start with the spaces here at Bergen-Kunsthal. And despite the fact that this is going on, as I say, to the ICA and to the Kessner, the work will be reconfigured in response to their particular architectural spaces. So to talk about it downstairs in Bergen-Kunsthal, there's this kind of suite of 4 rooms that you kind of have this enfilade that they're all interconnected. And I know in our press release we've used this kind of quote from you where you've talked about trying to kind of see the work as one piece that's kind of spread or smeared across those rooms. And I guess the most obvious thing for people who've been looking at your work for a while is that you've really disconnected the soundtrack from the video in a sense. And so there's still video down there and there's still sound. And actually looking at the work, it's very familiar, a lot of the kind of aesthetic and sonic qualities in that work. But it really does feel very different in the way that you've separated those out, and rather than them being collaged in a kind of synchronicity, there's a simultaneity, and they kind of exist side by side, and a very different spatial arrangement. But maybe you could say something about how you approach this new work.
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's. I guess in a way it became this kind of logical next step of a thing to try, or at least the next experiment would be to think about structuring what I was doing, because what I was doing in terms of space rather than in terms of time, basically. So rather than having something that was 10 minutes long or 5 minutes long, and it was a series of these sort of separate sections that kind of segue into one another, which is the kind of structure of the videos, to actually just sort of see, and maybe it was particularly stimulated somehow by the spaces here, which are so clearly like units of one another, you know, like the building being kind of purpose-built gallery and having these very particular kind of proportions, and you kind of read the kind of room you first enter, and then the first one on the left as kind of being the same size, and then the smaller one is a smaller version of that, and then there's the largest hall, which feels like a multiple of the medium size, and so you see this thing very much, and it's all on the same plane, you know. So you kind of see this space immediately as a thing that you kind of walk through, you know, and also that you kind of look back and you kind of see through a number of doors. So it all suggested lots of things around like timelines or something, and sequences of scenes or frames. You know, you could use that analogy, I suppose. So it felt very natural then to want to just try and kind of work with the space as a kind of whole, and to build all those things around transition and fade and kind of cut to, and this is happening while that's happening, which is going on in the video work, but to kind of build that just in across the walls and rooms. It's also the very pragmatic aspect of one of the hard things, I suppose, about video and working with video in exhibitions is things like acoustics, which are always invariably a problem. You know, so you make something in the studio and you get to the gallery and it sounds really echoey and horrible suddenly, where it sounded really good in the studio, or you're showing in the next room there's another work and the two pieces are clashing with one another and the soundtrack's leaking between rooms, you know, and you know, and people aren't really sure how long they should spend with each work, and there's all these kind of temporal and spatial kind of problems around video in the gallery, and particularly in larger solo shows or in like group shows. And I guess I was kind of having experienced these and tried to resolve these in many ways, you know, in showing my own work. I kind of, one thing that felt necessary and really interesting to try is how to kind of build all those things actually as the structure of the work. So how can the echo between rooms become like a productive, generative element of a piece, rather than something you're having to like build walls to kind of to remove or getting stressed out by, you know, and so kind of actually just building in spaces that have no sound and other spaces that have only sound, you know, are ways of just really constructing a piece that, so you're not really kind of battling the building, you're kind of you're using the building to kind of guide a lot of those decisions.
And you mixed really the work in those spaces over a period of 4 or 5 days and nights, actually. So it was, you came again with this kind of material, this kind of archive of sound, but also images, and we'll talk about that in a minute, the videos. And then it was really mixed in those spaces, for those spaces.
And I found, I mean, I had one of those setups that's downstairs, those kind of groups of speakers and, you know, and a computer. In a studio in Berlin where I live at the moment, but you know, the studio is a small old shop, so it's a tiny little room, and I was working on this kind of piece, but then as soon as I arrived here and put it all out, it's suddenly in this room that was sort of 15 times the size, you know, with a kind of a solid floor and everything. The acoustics are so different that actually like a lot of things which I found strong in the mix I was making in the studio weren't strong, and then a lot of things which I was less interested in suddenly became really powerful, and there's this kind of realization of how those kind of physical effects, those physical differences actually really affect the emotional charge of certain samples and certain materials. And so it really quite immediately became apparent I was going to really just like reconfigure the whole thing to actually what the room was doing, you know, and so it's I guess it has to be a kind of responsive process to work with the building in that way.
And the video pieces, which are these kind of collaged, and again, you talked about this when you were here at the very beginning of the exhibition, but it was very interesting when you talked about the fact that normally when you'd work with video on these kind of 10, 15-minute videos, you're cutting and you're thinking about collage or montage as a sequential thing. But here with these screens, it was like these 2 split screens, that was the format. And it became much more like a spatial or more like the way you work with collage in terms of paper collage or print or something. And I know as well through the process that, you know, they came quite late, those video. You were playing with a lot of different material. And what I'm curious about is that obviously when you're working on those earlier works that we've looked at, there's a kind of backwards and forwards relationship between video and sound, as you've talked about. But there still is something that you're kind of referring backwards and forwards to in terms of that visual imagery or that starting point. But I'm really curious here as to when you were working purely with this kind of sound material, I mean, you've talked about it being much more musically driven, but was there anything more tangible or thematic, or what were you, or was it purely kind of experiential?
Sure. I mean, there was a few. I mean, there was a few sort of backbones. I made a piece which we'll watch now, perhaps Radio at Night, recently, which in a way, it's the piece I've made that's most like a song. Like it functions like a song. It has a kind of chorus and verse and a reprise and on things in its structure. And and I was kind of, interested in that and interested in kind of pursuing that piece. And somehow this show felt like it was about kind of trying to think of ways of sort of reformatting the logic of that work across rooms or something. So I think musically I was going back a lot to the recording sessions I'd made at the time of making that piece, and I also worked on a whole batch of new vocal recordings, kind of again where people were kind of responding to that video, in order to work on this, to make footage that I could work with in this exhibition. And similarly, I drew somewhat on some of the visual motifs in that piece and brought them into this. But then I think it's also things like spatial as well. I mean, it sort of, for example, have tended to use sort of carpets to deaden sound in exhibitions. But here, because I like the floor so much, and I like this kind of mirroring that happens between the ceiling kind of panels and the floor and the shininess of the floor, I wanted to not do that, but wanted to work with kind of curtain in some way and make these curtains that sort of like shadow or kind of ghost the shapes of the walls that they're in front of or behind it. And somehow because of the floor, those curtains became this kind of very like deep grey, and then the video then had to kind of really respond and work and play off that. So it's very actually like I kind of came here with a lot of material on hard disks, and we had these screens and started outputting things, and literally it was just sort of about kind of, it was more like making a painting, like kind of making things and hanging them and being with that image for a while in that room and seeing how it sits and seeing how it feels. And
I mean, they operate much more like paintings. And thinking about the way you work with the Whitechapel show with that Bacon painting, there's an obvious kind of similarity, I guess. But also the video that you have used on there, I mean, we were talking earlier about this idea of getting very close into surfaces, like this kind of almost forensic interior. I mean, both the kind of the imagery itself seems to, like, some of it seems to have come from the laboratory or the kind of science, or it feels very internal and very close, and I mean even more forensic maybe.
Yeah, I think I guess there's something. Maybe it was due to this kind of square structure, or this arriving at this logic of these two squares on top of each other, that you start to see the things as kind of little kind of swabs or petri dishes, and yeah, I think they I guess things that similarly making a piece directly for a kind of flat screen, I guess, and similarly like a lot of the things have this kind of sense of being like pressed up against the glass or something, which I guess I was playing with and that, in the choice.
And you said something earlier to me that somehow the sound, when you get that close in and that tight, somehow the sound then is able to expand and sort of take you outside or kind of fill in some of those other spaces. Yeah,
I think there's, I mean, I guess in the show there's these kind of reversals of like, or odd distortions of like what's a background element or a decorative element and what's a foreground element and the work or something, and and all those things are a bit kind of mixed up and murky, so the curtains to sort of deaden the sound and be a backdrop sort of become like a thing, a dramatic presence of their own in the space or something, and or similarly the sort of the soundtrack becomes the foregrounded element, and then imagery becomes decorative or something, like a decoration for a wall, and kind of like the rather than the way it worked before, where it's more like a more cinematic relationship to the image, where it's the focus, it's the source of information. Somehow, I guess in working, trying to work a lot more spatially and to try and make this kind of total work, if you like, or this kind of actually the kind of the role or the accent on those different elements has changed compared with other pieces. Should we perhaps watch Radio at Night?
I was going to say,
think
if we watch Radio at Night, so just to explain, as you said, this was a work that you made for the Walker Art Centre for a project which it actually wasn't to be screened in the space, but was to be distributed through their website.
Yep. Yeah.
But it was a work that you were working on kind of simultaneously with the show here, right?
Yep.
And so a lot of the audio and a lot of the ideas were informing the development of this work. How long is it? It's
8 minutes.
8 minutes. And then once we've watched it, I'm aware that people might have some questions. So we'll watch this, and then we'll open it up in case people do have any questions. And this gives you 8 minutes to think of a good question if you want to. Okay. Are there any questions? Oh, could you just wait for the mic? It's because we're recording it. We can't hear you. But
So I just happened to walk in here today. I didn't know you or your work before. But I'm curious to know if you think of a team before you make a video, because it seems to happen more accidentally. So you look at the material and make this collage thing and put one thing next to the other, and that makes meaning. But do you think of some kind of meaning before you start making the video?
No. I mean, I think it's really like the process of making it is the process of finding out what it should be, if you know what I mean. Like without sounding overly romantic, it's like you have to get to the thing, you know, rather than having it and then finding a way of embodying it in a work to give to other people, which I know is an extremely romantic idea of what art making is or something, but like I think it's very much a set, you know, certain things start catching my eye in a certain sort of tone or texture, and I guess you want to kind of go into that and push that in some way, but it's through doing it that the form itself and the themes kind of start to come out, you know, and once they start revealing themselves more, you know, once a certain atmosphere starts becoming apparent, then of course then you start working faster and you can start kind of crafting it more, you know, but it has to be done to find out.
So you must have a lot of unfinished works as well, I guess.
Yeah. And bits of things. There's lots of bits of things. Say in that piece there, there's extracts in there that I've been kind of toying with and trying to work with in things for a really long time. You know, I might have had for 10 years or so. And there's things that have appeared in other videos. You know, that again, like 7 or 8 years later, appear in another piece. But the kind of certainly the kind of emotional theme, if you could call that, is definitely one where it's through doing it that you start sort of getting to it, you know, and then you start in the final kind of editing really trying to start sort of build that and kind of strengthen that, you know.
Thank you. I have a question about in this video, like sound downstairs. I find a lot of like kind of meditative, transcendental. I don't know how to describe it. When you can kind of can get lost inside your mind, or like kind of, was it intention, or it's like, do you have some kind of connection with this? Like, I don't know how to explain. Like, how did you catch it, or is it kind of aim, or it just happens, or maybe it's only like work for me, like in this case, in this situation. I don't know. So.
Yeah, I think if I know what I mean, I think it like. I guess this idea of like going into trance or something is definitely, I don't quite know why, but it's something that kind of comes up in the work a lot. You know, I think not so much in any of these. I guess maybe that kind of Harlequin, for example, that Harlequin passage in this video is from a kind of erotic, a kind of soft erotic film from the kind of mid 1980s, in which a boy goes on holiday with his parents to Venice and then kind of steps out and is kind of enchanted by harlequins and taken to an orgy or something. So it's like, I mean that in a very literal way, but then other things, this idea of people being kind of possessed and kind of swept along, is in the visual material often. There's often kind of hypnosis or I guess...
There's a work called When You Fall Into a Trance, right?
That's, no, it's,
okay.
And then, you know, things like the human eye, I guess, standing in for kind of going in, like a surrogate for some idea of consciousness or entering consciousness or the soul, you know. So I don't know, I think these certain sort of trance in between states, you know, between waking and sleep, between abstraction and figuration or something, are kind of it's a place I like to go a lot in the work.
Are there any other questions or comments? Or yeah, Steiner.
You talked about how in this show or recent development, sound and image are more separated. And I was curious, also after hearing Dan Fox's talk here about your show earlier, if you have or are planning to work only with sound, for example, to separate it completely, for example, putting out the record or.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I did as a teenager. So I for very small, kind of self-publishing sort of things. But I've made albums and stuff, and was in a kind of, I would do like live improv kind of things as yeah, like to say. So anyway, for me, that was always the first sort of point, you know, outside of doing it like art at school or something. I mean, I think I stopped for a reason, in the sense that the idea of like releasing records somehow doesn't totally speak to me. I think being able to control, I'm probably quite controlling actually, so it's probably like being able to control the way someone's experiencing the thing is probably quite important, you know, and that's probably why art and installation, if you like, or the art gallery as a format is when I stay in, rather than the cinema or the concert hall or the album, you know, because I think this kind of total, even if it's quite discrete, you know, kind of building the framework in which someone's experiencing something is something I have a desire to. So, but I think, I mean, people I've released sort of mixes quite frequently. Me and a friend often at Christmas time will make a kind of mix and send them to friends on email. So I sort of do that, but in any more more professional, if you like, way, I don't really have much desire to, because I guess in art you can do it all, but also control it as a context, or control the reception in particular ways.
Well, we've talked for an hour and 20 minutes. I should just qualify that when you fall into a trance, I realise it's Emily Wardell,
I thought, yeah.
who we're doing a show with next year. So that's why Emily's on my mind as well. But yeah, that's Emily's work, not yours. But thank you so much, James. It was wonderful to have the opportunity to see those earlier works, actually, and also to hear you talk so openly and generously about them.
Right, my pleasure.
Thank you also for the wonderful work that we've been enjoying for 5 weeks here in Bergen.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone for coming, and please join me in thanking James Richards.